Okay, welcome back, guys. So Kieran here again from the Dublin Academy of Education, continuing my discussion on the poetry of Adrienne Rich. So to date, we have just done the broad overview of Rich. So that's the biography, the themes that she likes to write about, and then the styles. And we've looked at Storm Warnings, we've looked at Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, and we've looked at Living in Sin. So today I'm going to talk about these last two poems in your notes, page 96, we're going to start with Trying to Talk with a Man. I think the title sort of says it all, really, in terms of what we maybe anticipate this poem is going to be about, or certainly how we anticipate this poem is going to unfold. It's an unusual poem in many respects, and what we're seeing here, and similarly with Like a Survivor, is this departure by Rich from conventional, traditional poetic structures. And as soon as you see this on the page, that probably leaps out at you. So we're going to have a read of it, and then I'll explain a little bit about what's happening. There's just a context for this, so you have some understanding of it. It does appear to be a personal poem about Rich herself and her own relationship with her husband. And the setting is out in the desert where, as the first line of the poem indicates, where nuclear explosions were being tested, or at least not obviously in the path of these nuclear explosions, but rather from somewhere where they could be viewed from a safe distance. Again, in the 1950s in America, this, like that nuclear testing phase was particularly, I suppose, prevalent. Again, the era here is maybe slightly unspecified, but we can assume that it's in and around that, possibly a little bit later on. But the bomb testing in the poem becomes more of a metaphor for testing the strength of the relationship, and that's essentially what this poem trades on. So, Trying to Talk with a Man. Out in this desert, we are testing bombs. That's why we came here. Sometimes the river forcing its way between deformed cliffs, an acute angle of understanding, moving itself like a locus of the sun into this condemned scenery. What we've had to give up to get here. Whole LP collections, films we starred in, playing in the neighborhoods, bakery windows full of dry, chocolate-filled Jewish cookies, the language of love letters, of suicide notes. Afternoons on the riverbank, pretending to be children. Coming out to this desert, we meant to change the face of driving among dull green succulents, walking at noon in the ghost town, surrounded by a silence that sounds like the silence of the place, except that it came with us and is familiar. And everything we were saying until now was an effort to blot it out. Coming out here, we are up against it. Out here, I feel more helpless with you than without you. You mention the danger and list the equipment. We talk of people caring for each other in emergencies, laceration, thirst. But you look at me like an emergency. Your dry heat feels like power. Your eyes are stars of a different magnitude. They reflect lights that spell out exit when you get up and pace the floor. Talking of the danger as if it were not ourselves, as if we were testing anything else. So there are moments where this poem becomes slightly more abstract, and again, this is where we need to resist the temptation of sort of translating every line. There are certainly, there's some imagery in here which is quite personal. So as we move down through it again, maybe try and resist the thing of, I must understand what every single line means, but rather look at the cumulative effect that this has. So as I said, structurally this poem is very interesting. Take a note of the fact that it is an unconventional structure. They're going to get both of these poems I'm going to be talking about today really are very much unconventional, as in non-traditional. She's very much breaking away from, say, the more traditional structures of something like Aunt Jennifer's Tigers. These first two lines in particular really stand out because they stand alone. And when we talk about pattern in poetry, we talk about the layout and the shape of the poem. Things like this are noteworthy. So remember I said to you before about noticing things and then deciding like what significance might that have, or what impact, what effect is that particular structural decision having here. So there's that element of it, and there's also then the absence of punctuation, which again, in a slightly Dickinson-esque way, what we're seeing here is very much a freeing herself from sort of traditional, conventional poetic structures. So The title, first of all, just very quickly, notice the a man, not the man or my man, but trying to talk with a man. So that is what we call the indefinite article, like the being the definite article, something specific. So what happens here is even the title itself, while it does seem that the poem is a reflection on her own relationship, it kind of takes on this universality. You know, when I've talked to you before about the personal and the universal. So here it's the universal. It's the idea that this could in a sense apply to any man. Out in this desert, we are testing bombs. Take note of the pronoun we here, because we don't know who she's referencing. It seems that it's an inclusive pronoun one way or another. It seems to be a reference to possibly the country of the United States. This is what we're doing. But when we look at this poem metaphorically, and we look at the bombs as being somewhat metaphorical as well for the relationship, then the we also seems to apply to herself and her husband. So again, that's a line where there's a little bit of interpretation happening, but do take note of it. But it's where the metaphor really develops or is introduced. In the second line, that's why we came here, does seem to specifically refer to herself and her husband. So this is why the echo and why the question mark around the who the we are. But this is establishing the metaphor, the connection between her husband and herself and their relationship and this bomb testing that's happening out in the desert. And as I said, take just note of the fact that those lines stand alone, so we're immediately, our attention is drawn to them, and the pace of the poem, we kind of think about those lines. There's an impact there. This next section, sometimes I feel an underground river. Firstly, the shift is onto the I, so the individual voice. So again, it's a confessional poem of sorts. And again, this one, and also from a survivor, what is noteworthy about these poems is confessional element, the honesty, the idea that really Rich is kind of bearing her soul a little bit here, and she's moving away from sort of, you know, using maybe personas or using the third person narrative voice, but instead she's very much talking about herself. This imagery is interesting. Sometimes I feel an underground river forcing its way between deformed cliffs. The effect, take note of that line. Firstly, because of the move to the personal, but secondly, because the imagery here suggests something confined. The idea of something underground, a river that's trapped and is forcing, the note, the verb forcing, and also the image of the deformed cliffs. So the idea of something maybe trying to forge its own path or escape. And again, connecting this back to Bishop's own personality, her struggle to establish herself as a poet in a male-dominated world, her struggles to reconcile her own sexuality, particularly in the context of a relationship like this. You know, we can start to see, you know, where this where this imagery comes from. And note also in there the idea of the condemned scenery. So that's a reference to, you know, the desert surroundings. But again, there could be a metaphorical element in here. Either way, take note of the fact that it is a bleak image, possibly a reflection on their relationship. This next section then, where we focus on all of these images, it seems that, you know, from her and her husband, they seem to be images relating to the relationship. And again, this is where we resist the temptation to try and translate every element of this. What we have is a series of memories, it seems, and presumably some of these are quite personal. Because of the fact that the poem does include this inclusive pronoun we, it involves the husband and is essentially, you know, addressed to him. So presumably he would understand the significance of some of these. Maybe just take note of the fact that she mentions the language of love letters and of suicide notes, and how those two are played together in the same line. But there's obviously a very strong or fundamental contrast to the idea of what love letters and what suicide notes represent. And when we look at from a survivor, we can't help but echoing back to this idea as well. The complexity of the human experience, the complexity of human relationships is kind of what's being suggested here. And when she moves into the next section of the poem, coming out to this desert, again, this is where we start to see the honesty. So maybe highlight the lines, coming out to this desert, we meant to change the face of driving among dull green succulents. That's sort of a condensed image that really just captures sort of suburbia, you know, dull green succulents, this idea of, you know, trees, the trappings of sort of suburban living. But dull, she describes them as dull rather than vibrant, which we might expect. So again, the suggestion here is that their lives together are dull. They come out here for an escape, come out here to sort of do something different, and they were looking for a change. But, and this is the crux of the problem within the poem, they are still surrounded by the silence. Take note of that line and take note of the enjambment, how the silence, and she used the enjambment to move that into the next phase of the poem that sounds like the silence of the place, except that it came with us. So take note of those lines as well. Surrounded by a silence that sounds like the silence of the place, except that it came with us and is familiar. Because this is the honesty, this is the confessional nature of this poem. This is where she's exploring how realistically they brought all these problems with them and they haven't been able to escape them. So this desire for change, this desire for something different, this is desire to escape their old life, but the inability maybe to do that, and silence being the connection between both the place and their experience there, but also their own lives back at home. Poor communication is certainly suggested here, that they don't communicate very well, and that maybe there's a lack of understanding between them. Coming out here, we are up against it. Highlight that line at the bottom of page 96, because again, the honesty there. She knows that this relationship, like testing bombs, testing this relationship, the outcome is probably not going to be good, and this is the direction the poem is moving in. Out here, I feel more helpless with you than without you. Definitely take note of those lines. Again, the sense of helplessness, the sense that this relationship is just fundamentally doomed and is not going anywhere. You mentioned the danger and list the equipment. We talk of people caring for each other in emergencies. So there's an indication here, again, an allusion or a reference to the conversations maybe they were having out there. But what we get, again, building on this idea of the poor connection between them, the poor communication, she really doesn't seem, she and he do not seem to be on the same page. It's like he's focusing on one element of nuclear war and thinking about it in a very practical sense, in a very almost literal sense. She's thinking about something else. It's like he doesn't fully understand why they're actually there, in the same sense that she does. Take note of the line, you look at me like an emergency. So what's happening here is the contrast between their responses and the idea that really he doesn't get it from her perspective. So a very personal poem, a very honest poem in that sense. Your dry heat feels like power. Your eyes are stars of a different magnitude. Again, just noting there the idea of power, and the idea of that theme that preoccupies Rich, the idea of power within relationships, and how he seemed to be exuding some kind of power.
When you get a laugh.
Conclusion to that idea is that the third line in that section, they reflect lights that spell out exit. So maybe take note of that line, that spell out exit. It's a little bit dramatic in a sense, but it's the effect here is of Boland, of Rich looking her husband in the eyes and realizing the truth, seeing the reality that it's exit, that she needs to get out. So despite the power, in a sense, that he's exuding, presumably the attraction or possibly just the weight of a history, of a relationship, she knows this is over. She knows that they're out. And how, again, the three last lines of the poem really reinforcing this idea of him not getting it, talking of the danger as if it were not ourselves, as if we were testing anything else. Look at the repetition of as if, those final two lines, and how, again, even as and the effect of this is the idea that he's sort of chattering about the practical elements of preparing for nuclear war. It was a very real concern for people in this particular historical period in the US, and how Rich is just thinking about something completely different and thinking about their relationship and this disconnect and the distance that's between them. So note that, and note the fact that what we really see here is Rich developing her own style, finding her own voice, experimenting here in the way that she uses the language. Great poem, and again, very much exploring that theme of relationships. So, what we're going to do then is move on to the last poem in the collection we're looking at, which is from a survivor. So this is on page 100. And again, also concerns her relationship with her husband, but in a very, very different way. So the background, I suppose, to this, as is outlined here in the notes anyway, is that this poem, written in 1972, so I jump forward in time here, But in 1968, Rich's father died, and in 1969, she and her husband separated. And then in 1970, he committed suicide, presumably as a result of the fallout from that split. So the backdrop to this poem is quite tragic, but I think the title is significant because she identifies with being a survivor, and it almost reads like a sign-off from a letter that she's written. Now, it's not that the poem itself reads in any way like a letter, but that title does, and it's almost as if she's writing to her husband who has passed, he's deceased, but sort of reflecting a little bit on what happened between them, and that she's someone who survived it, and she's sort of sending this message maybe to him. Note the structure of this poem before we begin as well. Note how it's very fragmented, and that's a great word to use to describe this poem, because it really does feel like it's in pieces. And again, that is not coincidental, in the sense that the fragmentation of the poem does really seem to, again, reflect sort of the breakup of the relationship, maybe the fragmenting thought processes, but also, ultimately ends in something more affirming than that. So while it's the backdrop is grim, in the tragic element, and the poem itself is quite poignant. Again, we have this word like the poignancy, the idea of something tinged, I suppose, with strong emotion, particularly sadness. So this is a poignant poem, knowing that history. It's also a kind of a poem of a little bit of affirmation, and the title does suggest that from the beginning. Note that it kind of takes a movement really from the past sort of into the present, and then the ending sort of looks to the future. So there's a kind of a linear progression through this poem. From a survivor. The pact that we made was the ordinary pact of men and women in those days. I don't know who we thought we were, that our personalities could resist the failures of the race. Lucky or unlucky, we didn't know the race had failures of that order, and that we were going to share them. Like everybody else, we thought of ourselves as special. Your body is as vivid to me as it ever was, even more since my feeling for it is clearer. I know what it could and could not do. It is no longer the body of a god, or anything with power over my life. Next year it would have been 20 years, and you are wastefully dead. Who might have made the leap we talked too late of making, which I live now, not as a leap, but a succession of brief, amazing movements, each one making possible the next. So, things to note in this poem, particularly right from the beginning, the word pact should be jumping out at you. She mentions it twice in the first line. And that word suggests a sort of a legal contract. A pact is like, it's a kind of a cold word, suggestion of something kind of formal, which is obviously a reference to marriage and the institution of marriage. But here she sees it more in the legalistic sense. It's as a pact. The we, of course, is introduced immediately, so we know that she's involving the husband, and it's very much about him and to him. And it's also very much, this poem is so noteworthy for its honesty and its confessional nature as well, that she's being bluntly honest here about how looking back over their lives and the arrangement, I suppose, that existed between them. The ordinary pact of men and women in those days. Take a note of that line. That's essentially marriage, but this is the way that Adrienne Rich is now reflecting on it from this new position that she's in. I don't know who we thought we were. Take a line of that. The idea, again, it's kind of echoing again the living in sin. The idea of naivety. The idea that she and he really didn't know what they were getting into, that they were just doing what was normal for that time. And what she refers to as the failures of the race in the third line in that section seems to be suggesting about failing relationships in general. The failures of the race makes this universal. And that is certainly significant, this idea that everybody maybe goes through this, or that failure is just something that's part of the human experience. But with youth and arrogance, Rich is now kind of reflecting, he never felt that this was possible, that they would ever sort of experience this. So again, the naivety, lucky or unlucky, and that's even the juxtaposition to ideas. That she's even reflecting on this now. She's not entirely sure how she feels about that, but maybe highlight the lines: we didn't know the race had failures of that order. Again, the naivety that's coming across here, the sense that the innocence that they both experienced. And I love the line, and take note of it. Like everybody else, we thought of ourselves as special. Again, this kind of is so honest, so confessional, but also expands the poem outwards into a more universal idea that everybody experiences this. We thought we were special, so did everybody else. So again, this sense of honesty. Now, the tone is interesting here because there's a sadness to it, as I said, a poignancy, a sense of regret, and so on that underlies this honesty. But as the poem moves forward, as she begins to sort of reflect on these experiences and reflect on this reality, it moves to a different place, and there is a tonal shift towards the end. She focuses here on the physical nature of the relationship, the sexual nature of the relationship. Your body is as vivid to me as it ever was, even more since my feeling for it is clearer what it could and could not do. Again, this idea of power, echoing back to trying to talk with a man, and the idea of the dry heat and that power. Again, this idea that at some point, her husband held power over her, even in some sexual, physical way, not in a sinister way, but rather that she was attracted to him. But now, knowing and having reconciled her own feelings and her own sexuality, that power does not exist in the same way. She says, it is no longer the body of a god or anything with power over my life. And at least highlight that line, anything with power over my life. And again, this is a subtle exploration, or a subtle reference again to that theme of inequality, strongly suggestive of the imbalance there, that maybe he held more power over her. Not, again, any fault of his, but more the society that they lived in and the way that the society was set up. And as the poem enters its final phase, if you like, it really is where it becomes poignant, and just again the tragedies emphasized, particularly those lines, and I think it's certainly worth highlighting these as well. Next year it would have been 20 years and you are wastefully dead. And it's, again, the honesty, but the sadness that those lines is tinged with. The wastefully is the key word in here. That everything that suggests, that what a waste, like that we could have maybe figured out some other way around this, but instead it's just that this idea that he's gone now and there's nothing that can be taken from that. So it is very touching in that respect. And when she reflects on it, and the way and then the metaphor of the leap is what creeps in here at the end of the poem. The leap that she feels that if only he could have made with her. This leap being a metaphor for, moving into some other phase of their relationship, moving into accepting that things were changing, that they were not the same people they once were, that this ordinary pact that existed between them has evolved and changed and moved on. If he were able to make that leap, as she has done, that maybe this tragedy wouldn't have happened, maybe he wouldn't be dead, and he certainly wouldn't be wastefully dead the way she references it here. So highlight as well the lines, the leap we talked too late of making, and particularly the idea of the leap that is fundamental to this final image here, because the leap is really about embracing the future, embracing the new life. The leap, she says, which I live now, not as a leap, but, and highlight this, a succession of amazing movements, each one making possible the next. Get those two lines in there. A succession of brief, amazing movements. Look at the quality of those words. This is what I'm saying, moving very quickly from this poignancy and this touching tone, not sentimental, but certainly a lot of sadness there, but not necessarily regret. And certainly, and this is one of the most significant things about this poem, is it is very much from a survivor, but there's no sense of guilt here. There's no sense from Rich that she kind of feels like, she is necessarily responsible for this. It's rather just the sadness at the fact that he was unable maybe to make that leap with her, but that her life sort of now continues. So it's very much looking to the future. There's a sense of optimism here at the end, this sense of continuity. And look at the arrangement of the lines here as well, and the structure. Two things worth noting. The second last line, brief amazing movements, leaps onto the final line, each one making possible the next. So again, the enjambment there, the sense of movement forward, which is she's living her life now, and also the absence of the full stop at the end of this poem, which is highly significant because the full stop indicates an end to a sentence, an end to a thought, but here, because it's absent, it's almost a similar but not identical effect that the ellipsis has of something which is open-ended, something continuing. So an idea of sort of leaping forward into the future. So she has survived this experience, she has survived this, he unfortunately hasn't. She's obviously deeply saddened by that, but there's not a sense of guilt. There's rather a sense of just the sense of loss, but also accepting in an unapologetic way that life is an adventure. Life is, and I like that way of thinking about the brief, amazing movements as being a sort of a metaphor in a sense for the adventure that is life, for just going out into the world and just experiencing all the things that it has. Being yourself, which is really what it's even the significance of the fact that her father died in 1968 and then she separated in 1969, that almost the breaking away maybe from those expectations that she's kind of celebrating here and so on. So although I have to come back and talk about The Uncle Speaks in the Drawing Room, or well, have to, I want to, but really in terms of the spread of the poetry, this is sort of chronologically the one. So again, consider it in dealing with it in terms of the relationships, the marriage, trying to talk with a man, and potentially and Jennifer's Tigers and Living in Sin. So a nice connection between all four of those. I will see you tomorrow for The Uncle Speaks in the Drawing Room, and then a final wrap up and looking at a couple of personal responses as well. See you then.